can't add to the beautiful and eloquent eulogy Geraldine has just spoken on behalf of myself and our brothers and sisters. They tell the story of a beautiful and fulfilling life that was well lived. What I wanted to offer today instead is one man's tribute to another man. As you have heard, John Gerard Brophy had a difficult start in life. Born into poverty, losing his mother before he even really knew her, and then to be separated from his father to live his formative years in what today we call state care. From the age of 3 to 15, at which point, in his own words, he was unleashed on the world. Young John would have experienced great pain in his early life. The unavoidable feeling of rejection as his father remarried to a woman with 5 children of her own. There was no such thing as a blended family in 1930s Dublin, and the choice had been made. But today I do think on my grandfather, Phil Brophy, with compassion, because he had a difficult choice to make, which no doubt also caused him great pain. And whatever his faults and failures were, his son John would have forgiven him many years ago. Such a start to life could have produced a much darker man, one filled with rage and bitterness, and John had the right to be angry. But what is extraordinary is that it actually produced a young man of great love and compassion and commitment to serve. Faith was the bedrock that this young man was built on, and from his earliest years he lived that faith every day in many different ways and throughout his 93 years. On entering the world as a young man, he did the good things young men do. He learned a trade, worked hard, made friends, practiced his faith, and for a time moved to England for better opportunities and to broaden his mind. Of course, we can then fast forward to the most important event in any young man's life, to find the woman you love and make her your own. Knowing John, I think when it came to matters of the heart, at a younger age, he would have been quite shy and retiring, and naturally afraid of the rejection that he experienced as a child. However, when he first met Marie-Therese Waters, I'd say John was struck by thunder. A most beautiful, intelligent and endearing young lady you could never meet, and one who of course shared his deep faith. Now John had to work very hard to woo his bride, and that included navigating a family who were very protective of their only daughter and sister. But persevere he did, and showed great patience and courage before she finally said yes. What followed, as you have heard from Geraldine, was a most beautiful life, filled with love and laughter, of countless happy memories and experiences shared. And of course that life is spent for the most part in New Zealand, and is also worth remembering, as Geraldine has said, the great bravery that took for Mary and John to gather up their children and move to the far side of the world for the better life they found. And to grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a choice that has shaped your own young lives. So how do you measure a man like John Brophy? Men have many ways of doing so, but there is usually a pretty consistent set of the most important qualities. First, is he a family man? Does he have family values, and has he raised, provided for, and protected his wife and children? Well, of course, the evidence of that is all around us today. Nothing more needs to be said. However, for a man of great faith and dedication to service, I think it is fair to say that John had a different definition of the word family from most of us. And as a result, he provided for a very large family indeed. Is he a good mate? Have you shared many of the happy and sad experiences of your life with him? Can he be relied on to be there for you when it matters most? Again, of course, the answer is yes. John had many close friends through work and church and his community. Perhaps the only thing missing is that lifelong stayed in contact with across an entire lifetime. John's start in life and how it played out didn't really allow for this. I have no doubt he had good mates and friends in those early years, but as with many young Irish men of his generation, time and tide will take him to the other side of the world, and those connections were lost. However, I don't think John pined for those relationships, and instead he chose to fill this part of his life with many, many friends. He had that quality of having only met him briefly. You felt you had known him your whole life and wanted to share your life with him. Is he a tradesman? Does he earn his living in a trade that requires skill and experience? And is he good at it? Yes, John was a trained fitter and turner who could build, fix and maintain any manner of engine, vehicle or machinery. In the age before your car ran on a computer, John could help you get any make and model back on the road. And sometimes he could identify the problem just by listening to it. Now, as you heard from Geraldine, when it comes to other trades, carpentry or plumbing, well, this was not really John's forte. I am reminded of the old tradesman's adage, measure twice, cut once. But our friend John, he pretty much just cut. Sometimes with spectacular results. From cutting the legs off a table that would not fit through a door, to making a new wardrobe in a bedroom where he cut into the back of his own wardrobe and was surprised to find clothes there. I loved you, John, but sometimes you were a thick-headed. However, there is a more sobering counterpoint to the humour, and that is that John had vision. He could see in his mind's eye what he wanted to do, and sometimes that is more important than the end result. Is he a wealthy man? John was, of course, the absolute epitome of any number of quotes and adages and sayings about man's true wealth being in the life he leads and in the time he spends with his family and friends. I have no issue with a man's strive to accumulate financial wealth, because I think ultimately that allows you to create a life with opportunities for your own family. And I think John did aspire to those things. He worked tirelessly in what were largely tough physical jobs his entire life without really any significant financial reward. However, I think John did have a figure in mind, and that was once he had provided a home for his family, once all of the Christmases and birthdays and weddings had been paid for, then that was enough. Does a man present himself well? Does he care about his appearance? John was a very handsome man up until last Friday. And though he performed tough menial jobs during the week, he was always immaculately presented. Washed, shaved, and a collar shirt, tie and jacket were mandatory for any other event. I often heard him say, there is nothing quite like the feel of a new suit. And he was of that era of men where those very high standards of dress were not just expected, but they were enjoyed. Is he an intelligent man? As many of you know, John was a very learned and wise man, in almost any topic of conversation you could choose. There was, of course, an extensive knowledge of all things Irish: religion, music, language, history and politics, and an equally extensive knowledge of the Catholic faith. However, John possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of many other things. He could quote and explain to you the history and culture of many countries. He could recall a historical event and explain to you what happened and why it happened and what the outcome of that event was. He had a love of all sports while not really being a sportsman himself, and he could tell you who scored the winning goal for his beloved Aston Villa in a specific game on a specific date in 1963. As Geraldine has said, he could also recite verse, including Shakespeare, in a beautiful way, all from heart or memory. John was a lifelong learner, and for the most part, can lead a teacher? Can he hold his liquor? Well, herein lies perhaps the most beautiful irony of John's life. Because, as Geraldine has said, he was a lifelong teetotaler and a member of the Pioneer Total Abstinence Association, which is not just about abstaining, it's about ministering to people who have fallen on hard times because of drink. The irony is that John spent many a grand session in the presence of men who were fond of drink. But he confounded these men with his ability to get up and sing a song to make you laugh, cry, and perhaps the most powerful thing of all, to render an entire room of people utterly silent, all without taking a drink. Men did not just admire him for this, they respected him greatly for it. Does he have a talent or attribute that is unique to him that other men don't have? John had many talents, the trade I've spoken of, but also a fantastic gardener and chef. But of course the room is today filled with people who know precisely the talent I'm talking about, and that was that beautiful singing voice. This voice soared to great heights and great depths that could deliver happiness and laughter and tears in equal measure. I have often pondered how good that voice really was. Was it of the quality that John could have made a living from it? To have been a professional singer? And the only conclusion I can draw is that the answer to that question is yes. Given a different start in life, to be trained from a young age, or simply to have crossed paths with someone who knew what they were hearing, John may have taken a very different path. But I'm sure in his mind he ultimately used that voice in a much more rewarding way. He shared it with all of us and with the many people who crossed. And last of all, is he a hard man? The qualities I have spoken about today can come in any different order, and some men value more than others. But I've chosen to share this one last of all. Of course, what does this usually mean? Can a man handle himself in a fight? Is he good with his fists? Can he back you up in a fight? I have no doubt John needed to do this at some stage in his life. Young men rarely travel through life without it. But no, this really wasn't John, or not that I ever observed. He was a strong man, and with a quick temper, as we all have at times. But I think in these things John was more of a peacemaker. However, did he back people up in a fight? Yes, he did, many times. However, what does being a hard man really mean? Because without recounting everything I've said today, the life John led, from its beginnings to its end, required being a very hard man indeed. Quite simply, the hardest man I have ever met. And of all of the reasons I have shared with you today, I think his call to serve confirms this quality the most of all. Because John chose to spend much of his life with people in their greatest hour of need, at the lowest point in their lives, and to lift them up and restore their dignity and their pride. Some people run from a burning building, and some people run towards them. And John ran towards every burning building that he came across in his life. We all saw his service, but what people don't consider sometimes is the sacrifice that such a person has to make. And John sacrificed that most precious commodity of all, his time. So how to conclude my tribute to John? As Geraldine has spoken of. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, there is really only one fitting thing to say. And it is applied to the great and the good, from prime ministers to sportsmen, businessmen, and those who serve their community. Last Friday evening, a mighty totara did fall. And when I first wrote these words, I was going to finish them with the normal words you associate with that sentiment. That this man leaves a gap or a hole in our lives. And then I realised I hadn't chosen the right word. What John leaves us with today is a space for other men to fill.